welcome back to the 274th episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories, including the readjustment of some numbers coming out of the Gaza-Israel conflict, a article talking about the rising battle between China and India, and we're going to top it off with a little bit of VP speculation for President Donald Trump. More importantly, we're talking about one specific person, and that is Doug Bergham. So, with all that said, we're also going to end today with our Daily Delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. But that's enough rambling for me. Let's jump in to our daily debate. So whenever you see any numbers that come out of the Gaza-Israel conflict, what do you think immediately? I'll tell you what, I'll save it for when we get to the article, but I want to know, do you guys trust the numbers immediately? Do you trust one side rather than the other? Do you trust certain outlets more than the other? Do you have to see it in multiple places in order to actually believe some of these numbers? Because I feel when I've talked to people, there's a lot of skepticism, and some other people I talk to, there's no skepticism. They have their opinion, they have their side, and they say this side is 100% reporting it right. And we saw a little bit of adjustment from the UN. Now we're seeing even more adjustment from the AP. So we're going to jump into that article. It actually comes from Commentary, and the headline reads, "The biggest media scandal of the era has arrived." Now, let's be clear. Commentary leans a little bit to the right, and that is a pretty bold headline. So let's see what they use to actually back it up. And we are doing a little bit more of the traditional episode today where we're going to give a little bit more quote, a little bit less rant. Then we have our foreign policy segment, and then our little goofy, real fun short thing at the end, which is Doug Bergham. So let's jump into the first quote here. It's literally the first paragraph. Quote, "The Associated Press has an analysis up today that reveals," I hope you're sitting down for this, they're being sarcastic, "that the Hamas UN casualty numbers, especially the age and gender breakdown of those numbers, are way off. And again, steady yourself, those numbers have been obviously wrong for months, and nobody seems to have adjusted their reporting accordingly." So this next quote comes directly from the AP article when they're doing this analysis. Quote, "The health ministry announced a new death toll for the war. They announced new death tolls for the war nearly every day. It also has periodically released the underlying data behind these figures, including detailed lists of the dead. The AP analysis looked at these lists, which are shared on social media. They were shared in October, in January, March, and the end of April. Each list includes the names of people whose deaths were attributed to the war, along with other identifying details." And here's the next part that they're really going to seize on here in this article. Quote, "The daily death tolls, however, are provided without supporting data. In February, ministry officials said 75% of the dead were women and children, a level that has never been confirmed in the detailed reports. And recently, in March, the ministry's daily report claimed that 72% of dead were women and children, even as underlying data clearly showed the percentages were well below that." So let's take a step back. And this is the reason I asked that first question. Because I've had multiple conversations with people on the ground. My job takes me places where I have conversations about all this sort of stuff. And I've had very detailed questions posed to me from people who support Hamas. I should say more specifically, there were a few people that supported Hamas. I don't know about everybody there. A lot of them were just supporting the Palestinian people, and they were supporting Gaza. And I've also had questions posed to me from people who support Israel. And I have had a very, I don't want to say non-passionate, but I have not been drastically attached to either side. And the first thing that came up in one of these questions is, do you think what's happening in Gaza right now is a particular word which has a lot of weight? It's the G word, so to speak. And I called it the G word when I was having this conversation with this person. I said, "Hey, I'm not going to even use the G word." And they looked at me like I was there. Wait, oh, you're not going to even use the G word? You're going to totally devalue the conversation. You're not even going to call it what it is. And even when they were giving me the benefit of the doubt, they were saying, "Okay, you're not even going to acknowledge it. You can't even use the word." And this situation right here is exactly why. When you see things like this, where the Gaza Health Ministry They are a organ that operates within Gaza. We know that Hamas has tentacles throughout Gaza. We know that Hamas has even cooperated with the UN. And there have been different reports out there saying that multiple different UN agencies have people who actively support Hamas, or at least believe in the underlying ideology, which is Israel are the oppressors and we need to do what we can to shirk them off. We have seen multiple reports where people who believe this work within the UN. So we know that the tentacles of Hamas and this ideology go far throughout the country. We also know that there are strong supporters within the right wing of Israel, within the left wing of Israel, within all of Israel. Doesn't matter your left or right politics, who genuinely believe that they need to take an even harder line stance against Gaza. And after the attack from Hamas, a lot of people were even supporting not giving aid to Gaza. Because at the end of the day, they believe that that aid is going to not just go to the people, because it does very often get stolen by Hamas. So therefore, the aid you're sending in could also be going to the fighters, not just the people. So you can see that both sides have their very, very passionate beliefs, and they're going to try to win the media war, in my opinion. So if I've learned anything from my time in with American media, which is both sides have their agendas, as they should, as they want to, free market, blah, blah, blah. I don't really care. I'm not calling them out on being biased. I think that we should try to be objective, but I understand where the bias comes from. And at the end of the day, their money is coming from people who have an agenda. The point I'm getting at is you can see this even in America, in American media. You can see people with their priors coming in and shaping stories in very particular ways. And when it comes to the reporting on what's happening on the ground and shaping very specific narratives, just like when Fox News says something here in America or MSNBC says something here in America, and people believe the reporting coming out of them, it shapes how people see, at least the initial impression is cemented in people's minds, and it shapes how the rest of the narrative goes. Even if you hear counterfactual evidence at some point, or you hear elaboration on it, you still may hold that initial point of view that you were told. So getting information out that supports your side, especially when you're trying to win a PR war on the international scale, on an international front, then of course you're going to run into reports that are going to weight what you think will sway people really heavily one way or the other. So whenever I was having these conversations with these people on the ground, I said, can you really verify? Can you tell me right now that you know 100% the numbers that you're providing are 100% accurate? They're like, I can see the videos on Twitter. I'm like, that's not what I'm asking. Okay? I understand. You can see the videos on Twitter, on Telegram. I've seen the videos from both sides on Telegram and Twitter before. I'm not saying that what I've seen does not disturb me, does not make me angry, does not make me sad to some degree. And let's be clear, I'm not over here crying, but I've definitely rewatched videos and I've had a visceral reaction that this sort of thing can happen. And my point that I was getting at in that conversation is Al Jazeera is reporting a very particular way. The IDF, even some of the Israeli papers are obviously a mixed bag in that they don't just toe one line or the other. But my point being that they still have their perspective. They're still going to protect the nation that they are operating within and the sovereign nation that they obviously believe should exist. So everybody's going to have their priors. And we see this in reporting when talking about Hamas fighters who are underage. Hamas says anyone that's under 20. It's mentioned within this article. Normally, anyone that's under 20 is a child or a minor, and sometimes you see Israel doing the opposite, where if there's a person who's 15 and they're a fighter, they've been recruited by Hamas or just want to fight against Israel, they may just be called a male or person. So everybody's coming in with their priors. And that's why I tell these people when I was having these conversations on both sides, I'm like, guys, I'm sorry. We're not there. And I'm not trying to give hey, okay, well, no, you can't trust any authority thing. You take it all in, and you cannot base your suppositions solely on the numbers of what you're reading. You can't base your suppositions purely based on the ratios. You have to actually back up a little bit. And this article outlines, or at least this new analysis coming from the AP, really pointing out the fact that these numbers have not been right. I don't want to say it vindicates that position, but it does really solidify the wait and see mentality. And yes, I understand we can all say wait and see, and terrible things can happen while we're waiting and trying to find more confirmation. I'm not going to be naive and say that it's not going to happen, but at the end of the day, we need clarity on these sort of things because we are an outside nation. We are not directly involved in, and when I say not directly involved, it is not our nations going to war. It is not a terrorist group attacking the United States. So when we have to weigh these decisions moving forward, whether or not we're going to keep providing aid, what kind of aid we're going to be providing, are we going to be shipping more into Gaza than we're going to be shipping to Israel, what kind of military aid, all of these questions have to be weighed very, very carefully. And guess what? We have the luxury of not being directly there on the ground, so therefore we should seek clarity before we do any of these sort of things, especially as a public. Because as a national security infrastructure that's in place in Washington, D.C., they're already going to do things that is going to be basically agreeable to both sides, whether or not it's, I would say, 100% accepted. They're going to do what they've been doing for a long time, which is going to be continuing to give money to the UN and trying to get aid into Gaza while also supplying Israel. We've been doing this both sides thing for quite some time where we're supplying maybe in different ways, but we're still supplying both of these places with aid. So we're going to continue doing that. We have our priors. But when it comes to a day after solution, or sorry, when I say a day after solution, I mean a day after, maybe I should just not even say day after, because that word is so weighted nowadays. When it comes to a solution down the road, when the American people inevitably get tired of this information, the clarity that we have now based on the numbers, what's actually happening, how many people are being kept hostages, how many people have been used as all these sort of things will provide a clearer picture as to the way that we should move forward and really assess what happened here. So trying to get the live fire information, and that's the world we live in. Everything's coming really, really fast. But as we can see here, whether it's malicious intent on the Gaza Health Ministry or it's just the sheer fact that they're trying to get the information out quickly, either way, it's distorting what's coming out. And it's giving one perception that is definitely not true. And while I haven't seen, and let's be clear, I have not seen as much reporting about IDF numbers, okay? And that is also interesting that you don't really hear that perspective too much, but I haven't heard outright reporting about IDF numbers, but I would even take those with a grain of salt. And people would get really mad at me because they're going to say, well, Israel's sovereign nation, they're moral, they're righteous, they're our allies, so on and so forth. That's fair enough. They're also prosecuting a war. We know that when we went into Vietnam, we weren't telling the whole truth about what we were doing, about the losses we were sustaining, about the lack of progress. So to be naive enough to say, oh, well, no, you just have to trust Israel on this one too when they put out their numbers. No, okay, you're not going to, I don't think that's a prudent way to go forward. But that doesn't mean we can't have these sort of discussions about it. And also, we can return to the article here because they have even more commentary about the warping of these numbers overall. So we're going to jump back to the commentary from commentary.org. Look at that. They have commentary. Whoa, it's so surprising. Sorry, should stop being so sarcastic. We're only halfway through and I'm already bringing out the sarcasm. Quote, It's the clearly that gets me. This is the person being a bit sarcastic again. I guess I'm not the only sarcastic one. Quote, according to the AP, the share of women and children is down to 38% as of April and still declining. But keep in mind that children to the AP means those that are 17 years old and younger. Hamas, meanwhile, tends to count, careful there, doesn't always, tends to count. That's kind of hedging language in my opinion, but fair enough. Children who are 20 and under. So by the AP's own count, the true number of children killed in the war is almost surely even lower. Additionally, Hamas doesn't distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, which means a fair number of upper teenagers being counted as children here are actually combatants. And yeah, that's morally atrocious. That should definitely fall on Hamas about the fact that they're recruiting these sort of teenagers. We also want to have a situation, have a free, how should I say, a people not under the boot of Hamas so that they feel as though this is a proper way to move forward, to feel as though there's hope enough that they can actually rebel. And I use the word hope, maybe that's not the right one, because if you use the word hope, that implies that you have to crush the hope, versus some people saying that the opposite is the desperation. That's how they would describe it. Instead of saying it's what hope is what takes them forward and that they can possibly revolt and destroy Israel, versus the other people would say it's the desperation of their current situation. Hopefully, we don't have either of these as motivators. We don't want these people to turn to this as their solution, and that's what we have to really focus on here, because it is tragic that Hamas is recruiting young people. It is also tragic that those people feel as though it's a proper way to go forward, to live life, to express themselves, to get out of their situation, to really reach their political ends. Whatever way you want to frame it, it's just sad that these people are involved that way, and we don't want that situation to have to happen to them whatsoever. So, if we can try to alter the situation, whether that's from some people's perspective, which is to keep prosecuting the war until Hamas is gone so they can't recruit, versus you offer the Palestinians a state, I'm not going to pretend that I have the ultimate solution here. I'm not going to pretend that I know the best way to handle the Palestine-Israel conflict. But what I do know is that these numbers, the fact that they have been used as a bludgeon by one side over the other, and now they're being discredited, maybe that should make everybody, not just one side, everybody really start to question the sources of truth coming out of this, and it should definitely make one side question what they've been using this entire time as their sources, because it's questionable. It is really, really thin ice at best. So, with all that, let's jump to a little bit more foreign policy. And this one is on a topic that I love a lot more. I would have loved to lead with China and India, but I felt like that story was really important. Also, I felt like I had a personal story where I'm on the ground talking to people. I'm actually engaging on this one. So I felt like I could actually add more to that story rather than this next one where I can still add my opinion, but I don't have a personal anecdote where I'm able to really bring a little bit of extra clarity, a little bit of extra light, a little bit extra context to these sort of conversations. So this next one comes from Business Insider. Look at me again going to Business Insider. Wow, Business Insider. I think my algorithm is just feeding me Business Insider. It's like, oh, you like this one? Okay, give me. And I'm over here eating it like a little fat kid trying to go for the lollipop. So hey, I guess the algorithm is doing its job. So the headline reads, "The competition between India and China is about more than raw power." And yes, I think I disclosed this when I talked about China last week. It is not just simply about, oh, who's going to have more money? Oh, who has the largest population? Even though China is very angry that India has now officially surpassed it as the most populous country. But that's not just because it's India doing it, it's because of the fact of their declining demographics. But it does go beyond just raw power. So I want to kind of jump to the middle part here, because they outline what's going on in India. They say that India is a democracy and China is an authoritarian regime, throwing the outline here. But they also start to give a little bit more clarity about what's going on in India and how us just relying on the fact that they're a democracy and supporting them solely because of that may not be the best way to go about it. Maybe we should keep trying to reinforce democratic values while also realizing that it's not just about democracy, but pushing back against China's specific governance style. Because, let's be clear, you could have a very oppressive regime in control, or a very controlling regime with very tight laws that mandates a lot of things in your life, and yet it can cause a lot of happiness, it can bring a lot of joy, it can have very good social outcomes. A great example that you always hear is Singapore. Singapore basically had a dictator for a long time. They had really, really tight social controls, and yet a lot of people thrive there. A lot of people aren't happy, there's no doubt about that. But also the point being that they enforce certain social standards, they were thriving, they still are thriving for the most part as a country. So to pretend as though it just has to be authoritarianism versus democracy, it makes it so that the contrast is so stark that when you start to see a little bit of faltering within the democracy, like you may be seeing in India with Modi, and I'm not saying it's not a democracy anymore, but there have definitely been accusations that he's a little bit authoritarian. We've heard these for quite some time if you've been paying attention politically. I don't think that it's smart to frame it solely as democracy versus authoritarianism because, like I said, if that shine, that the how should I say, the coating, the gloss of democracy kind of falls off, and yet they still ensure a lot of social rights more than China does, but it loses its power because it isn't holding the exact same values that we do. I would say that right now, China is more of a political threat, so a geopolitical threat, and we need to address them. And yes, we may end up bolstering India into another geopolitical threat, but we got to deal with one thing at a time. We just want to make sure that they're not partnered together. I would guess, and let's be clear, I'm not pretending that I know anything about the meetings going on in the foreign policy world, but I would guess if you went into a foreign policy meeting, they're not there sitting, oh yeah, let's push India and China into the arms of one another. No, we need to keep them a little bit separate. We need to keep them at odds. And even if they're not imbuing all of the values we want, there's definitely something still there within India, at least the seeds of democracy and a freer populace, and a populace who is used to more freedom. And that is also very, very important. Sorry, I've been ranting on this one for a long time, but I do think it's important to line this up because we've talked about China in the past. So if you're just joining me for the first time, I'm sorry, you're a little bit left out. Go listen to some of my other China podcasts that involve China. You'll have a lot of more understanding of my thoughts of their economic system, their governance system, so on and so forth. But now that we're really doing a China versus India thing versus China versus the entire Southeast Asia, I felt like it was important to give India a little bit more time, even though I know that probably took up 2 minutes or so. Quote, India is the world's largest democracy. Its first elections were held in 1951 and 1952 after it gained independence from Britain. Free elections have been held in nearly every election cycle since, with a coup in 1975 barely threatening India's democratic status. It is a rare bright spot in a world where democracies seem to be in retreat. Even in the U.S., the global champion of democracy, former President Donald Trump, is accused of launching an attempt to cling to power illegally after losing the 2020 election. So you can see where Business Insider is coming down on that one. And whether or not you agree that that is 100% how should I say? That is 100% a sign of a failing democracy. The fact that those questions can even be raised. Yes, maybe it is a really important question to look at, saying, is this something that democratic societies deal with? I would say, I think you could make an argument for yes, but it doesn't look great when a large majority of the population, no matter what side you're on, actively questions the election. And this has been going up for years. This is not just a Donald Trump thing. There just happened to be a segment of the population that actually acted on it this time. But for the longest time, we've looked at, I've done this on the podcast before. Wow, look at that. I'm referencing a whole bunch of old podcasts. But we've looked at the amount of people that are dissatisfied with the results and believe that something was done that was against their candidate's favor, and it is always the opposite party, and it happens. It's been happening since around the Clinton era, maybe a little bit of the first Bush Senior, but it's really gotten worse throughout the 2000s. But my point being, and Business Insider's point being, oh, democracy is retreat around the world. Let's keep going. Quote, India isn't a perfect democracy, but it's still a role model for developing nations, large or small. And given the trends in some Western democracies, I would have to say that there are several things they, too, should be learning from India. And this is coming from Jabin T. Jacob, an expert on the India-China relations at Sev Nadar University in India. So another thing that they really want to go into here is why the China rise has affected the nations around it so much. And this is because that as the economies of these nations start to grow, a lot of the cheaper labor has already been in China, so they started to actually rely on them to some degree. Let's be clear, they have their own cheap labor, so a lot of things that would be internal they can say, okay, hey, yeah, we're going to have internal manufacturing for this. We're going to do some of our processes internal, but it does draw investment away from them because the other nations are like, okay, well, yeah, no, your labor may be a little bit cheaper, but China's already got the infrastructure. We don't have to wait 5 years. We don't have to pour in more investment. They already have the plants. So China has really drawn up all the air in the room for a while, and now we're starting to see China slow down a little bit. Their populace is becoming more used to higher wages, so now these other nations around it are looking very, very pleasing. And also, overall, the interesting thing I love when I talk about this conversation is both India and China have populations that are very, let's be clear, they have really large cities, but they also have large chunks of their population that are a little bit more rural in nature, and it's always interesting to look at the contrast. It feels as though in China that a lot of these population centers out in the rural areas are not really regarded as much, whereas in India it's been very fascinating to hear. I've heard one or two different conversations about Modi and different political parties actually sending teams out into the jungle to make sure everybody gets their vote. And this is just a great symbol of why these two nations are so different and two different approaches to getting everybody to buy into the system. One worries about the economic centers actually pulling people away from the rural areas, taking those kids away so that they could be workers, they can go to college, versus still trying to encourage these other people that we're speaking about India now, the people that are a little bit further out to be a part of the economy, but they are still willing to go out to them and say, you're a valuable person within our democracy and we want you to vote. And I think it's a great clash. I think that at the end of the day, I haven't done this article enough justice, and that's because I should have given it a little bit more time, but I don't want to run over too much. The last few episodes have been running really, really long. I want to give a nice, short, snappy 30-minute episode again. So if you want to read the rest of this article, just like the first article, as always, they will be linked in the description below that like and subscribe button. We're not done yet, but what I want to finish with this one on is right now, China, India, head-to-head in Asia. Okay, we are already backing India. We're in an alliance with India, Japan, and Australia. We're trying to push back against China. We are, depending on how we invest our money, invest our time, or invest our resources, we are going to define the geopolitical landscape for the next 100 years. The next 100 years, the last 200, maybe 300 years have been a little bit more Europe-centric with the expansion and control of the Asiatic, but a lot of the larger decisions were happening in Europe. And let's be clear, I understand there's many, many decisions that were happening in these Asiatic countries, and it directly affected what was happening in Europe, but the great powers were in Europe or in the Western Hemisphere with America, okay? This is defining the next 100 years with the re-rise of China, the dominance of Asian powers again, and it may even be the next 200 years. So we have to tread very lightly, and we have to take this very, very seriously. And when we're backing two systems, one system that directly says you're not valuable unless you're in a certain place and you're contributing a certain way, or another system that says, hey, we want to fight for you to be able to be represented in our government. And let's be clear, I understand there are exceptions to both of those cases. I think we know which one we should align with, and that will be how I want to close that article. So let's jump to our last article. It comes from the New York Times, and it is VP speculation about, guess who, Doug Bergham, mentioned him at the very beginning. And I just find it absolutely hilarious when the New York Times and all these other punches are like, oh, well, Doug Bergham apparently is on the short list. I don't know. Maybe it's just some of the people that I listen to on the right, because a lot of people I listen to on the left are like totally dismissing Doug Bergham. They're like, no, not happening. He's not going to be VP. Even people on the right were saying no. But some people that I was listening to on the right, they're like, yeah, no, he should definitely be. I think he's a great person, a great candidate. He's got the central casting thing. That's even a quote from the New York Times article because they mentioned that Trump said it. So I've always had it in the back of my mind. I'm like, yeah, he's probably top 6, in my opinion. I have one that there's one person who I keep saying, and people who I talk to about it, they're like, Alex, you're crazy. Why would you do that? Tulsi Gabbard. She's not on the short list, but I always thought that would be a good moderating move. She left the Democratic Party to kind of be an independent, but she was still in the Democratic Party. She has still some more or less Democratic points of view, or at least more moderate slash centrist than Republicans. So I don't know why he wouldn't think about it. If you want to play identity politics, which I don't think he cares about at this point, she is a woman. She's also from Hawaii. Then again, do you really think Hawaii is going to flip anyway? Probably not. Even if it did flip, does it really have that much of a large population and a lot of electoral votes? Not necessarily. But I always thought it was an interesting one, and I wanted it. Doesn't mean I think it was super duper likely. But my point being that no, don't ever count out Doug Bergham, okay? Even how they mention in this article that head of hair has something special about it. I don't disagree. There's something special about that head of hair and his story. While learning here, it's still a hard-fought story. He's a hard-working person. I didn't realize how much of it was like investing in these companies rather than founding them from the ground up. But he's had a very interesting life. It would be interesting to see him as the VP pick. But you can go read all about that yourself if you got a New York Times subscription. Don't want to tease you too much in case you don't. There's probably a reprint of it somewhere, or there's a commented on version on one of the other websites. So with all that, let's jump into our daily delight. And this one comes from ParadePets.com. Siberian Husky has absolutely zero chill after becoming obsessed with Tuxedo Cat. And when I read this, I was like, oh, is he chasing this cat? What's going on? No, this dog is obsessed. It's not even like he's chasing him down. He's literally just staring. And if you can't see what I'm doing right now, I'm just staring at the screen. It's so bizarre. You see some of the photos or some of the videos. I'm like, oh wow, this guy really does just want this one particular cat. It's almost as if it's a mailman. It's that kind of obsession. But if you want to see any of the photos or videos for yourself, you can go check out the article as well as all the other ones. Like I said in the middle here, it's in the description below that like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Casts, Google Podcasts, as well as Podvine, and the Twitter handle at Your Daily Flip, where I post a Twitter tirade every Tuesday and Thursday. So, with all that said, there is only one more thing to say. Stay safe. Don't die.